There really is nothing like child dedications. I love being a part of a community that values our next generation as much as we do here at Cornerstone. Parents, please know that we are in this with you. It takes a community to raise your kids, and so we are all involved. With all that being said, I just want to say that my name is Dan, and I'm a pastor here at Cornerstone. Today, we're going to cover the topic of forgiveness. And forgiveness is not a fun topic to talk about. I guess that's why it falls into this series that we've entitled Hard Things. Forgiveness is a journey that takes time. And just to be clear up front, I personally am not good at forgiveness. I've just had more practice than most. So they're like, Dan, why don't you talk? I was like, perfect. So this message is not coming from an expert. It's more like a campfire talk from a seasoned veteran when it comes to the topic of forgiveness. So the question that we're left with when we read the story of Joseph is, how do you forgive somebody that has done something terrible to you? How do you forgive something that seems unforgivable? Well, Desmond Tutu in his book, The Book of Forgiving, says, we are not responsible for what breaks us, but we can be responsible for what puts us back together again. Naming the hurt is how we begin to repair our broken parts. Mark Twain said this. It's amazing. Forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that crushed it. Takes a second, but that's a good one. And finally, Martin Luther King Jr. said it beautifully when he said, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. And when we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. Now, the reason that it's difficult to share on this subject are obvious. I know that there are some horrific stories of evil and devastation, even in this room. This will not be a message about forgiving and forgetting. It is not possible to erase memories, and forgiveness involves remembering the hurt. It's not about pretending that you weren't hurt or the offense did not happen. It's not about making excuses for others' behavior. Forgiveness doesn't mean that the other person is no longer responsible for their actions. And to be clear, if you are in a situation that is dangerous, I am definitely not advocating for brushing it under the rug and staying in a dangerous relationship. This message will be about gaining perspective through our worst hurts that allow us to do the inner work so that we can move towards freedom. It is a journey that sometimes takes a lifetime. And next week, Brian's going to be sharing like a part 2 on this message about reconciliation. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't lead to reconciliation. That's just reality. And forgiveness is about the work that we do that moves us towards freedom. And ultimately, this series is about learning lessons from the life of Joseph that move us towards maturity. And a surefire way to limit your maturity is to stay stuck in anger and resentment and to live with unforgiveness. So, how does the story of Joseph's betrayal start? Well, we know the story of Joseph by now. If you've been here the last few weeks, it starts in Genesis 37. If you haven't heard those messages, I encourage you to go back and catch up. They've been amazing. I've got a timetable that I'm going to share that's going to help us see the journey unfold. But before we get into Joseph with his brothers at the age of 17, we need to jump back in the story 11 years and hear about the story of Joseph at the age of 6. Our very own Gary Stanley, who goes here, wrote the book called The Story of Forgiveness that I highly recommend. In this book, he highlights the story of Jacob and Esau as the first story of forgiveness in the Bible. Now, if you don't know the story of Jacob and Esau, here's a quick recap, okay? They were twins. Esau came out first, but just barely. Jacob was grabbing onto his heel on the way out. Jacob steals Esau's birthright over a cup of soup incident. Then he tricks his father Isaac with a hairy arm incident. Ultimately, Esau finds out and he commits in his heart to kill his brother the next time he sees him. This is Joseph's dad, Jacob, that Esau is going after. Jacob flees, and he gets a taste of his own medicine. Laban takes him in, and he gives him his 2 daughters to marry, but he makes him have to work for him for 20 years in order to do that. Eventually, the Lord comes to Jacob and tells him to go back to the land of his father and his relatives. That is not good news for Jacob. He knows that that means running into Esau, who is committed in his heart to kill him the next time he sees him. It says, the Lord tells Jacob that he will be with him, which I thought was interesting because that's the exact same phrase that the Lord uses in speaking about Joseph. And then in Genesis 33, we see Esau sends out 400 of his men in front of him to greet Jacob. That is not a friendly welcome. That is, I am showing up in force. You're about to go bye-bye. Jacob splits up his family. He's terrified, okay? He splits up his family. He sends out tons of livestock and gifts to try to appease his brother and try to make peace. Here's how the story ends, and pay attention to this very little detail. In Genesis 33, it says that Jacob looked up, and there he saw Esau coming with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and he kissed him, and they wept. Joseph was the only brother of the 11 mentioned. He was there at the age of 6, in the midst of hundreds of people and ridiculous amounts of animals, to witness the first real act of forgiveness in the Bible. That is important. At a young age, he witnessed what it would be like for his uncle, who carried murder in his heart for 20 years, embracing and forgiving his lying and cheating dad. That's how his life started. Now let's fast forward to Joseph at 17. We know the story. He's his dad's favorite, and he's the youngest at that point. And he goes out and he gives a bad report on his brothers that are looking after the sheep. His father does him a real solid by making him this coat that's totally extravagant and ridiculous, like the most sweet thing you could ever get, just to ensure his brothers know that he is the absolute favorite. Joseph goes on to make things worse, and he tells them 2 different dreams about how they're all going to bow down to him and how he will reign over them. That doesn't go well. The brothers leave again to take care of the sheep, and Jacob again sends Joseph off to go check on them. I don't know why Joseph isn't working with them. That's a whole nother story. Joseph finds them. When they see him a long ways off, he's not hard to spot. He's got the sweet robe on. They see him, they're like, there's that dreamer, we're going to kill him. That's what they decide to do, the other brothers. But instead, they throw him in a cistern. They decide not to kill him and sell him as a slave. He's then sold into Potiphar's house until Potiphar's wife makes up a lie about him and he is thrown into jail. The timeline breaks down a little bit at this point just because we don't have all the details. The next thing we know, he's 28 years old and he's in jail. He interprets the dream of the cupbearer and the baker. They both worked for the Pharaoh. This is 11 years after he's sold into slavery. So they get out of prison, but they forget to tell the Pharaoh about Joseph. Until 2 years later, Pharaoh has his own dream. So Joseph sits in prison for 2 more years, a total of 13 years between being in Potiphar's house as a slave and in prison. He's now 30 when he has the opportunity to tell Pharaoh what his dream was, and out of nowhere he's promoted to second in charge of all of Egypt. Then we hear that there's 7 years of plenty that he had predicted, followed by 2 years of famine. These are the years that Brian talked about last week when he got married, when he had kids, when he worked a difficult job. So now we're talking about Joseph, and he's 39 years old. When his brothers finally show up, they're desperate, they're looking for grain. But the forgiveness, when they first encounter, doesn't happen right at the beginning. He recognizes who they are, but they don't recognize who he is. He messes with them the first couple of times. He speaks harshly with them. He calls them spies. He sends them back a couple times, but he leaves like silver and a cup in their bag to ensure that they have to come back. All that. And eventually he tells them who he is, and he's ready to forgive. So I want to read in Genesis 45, starting in verse 1. It says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence." They're like, "Joseph who?" Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt," just in case there was any confusion. "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save our lives by a great deliverance." Notice the perspective, the word choice. He says, "You sold me, but God sent me ahead of you." That's the perspective that comes from years and years of working through hurt. He recognizes that God was at work in the pain. I know it was you that sold me into slavery, but it was God's plan to do something better. And I set that all up to illustrate the point that sometimes forgiveness takes a long time. Can I get a witness? That's okay. It's a journey to work through anger and resentment and betrayal. I set all that up to illustrate the point that So all this together, we're talking about 22 years later. 22 years. Do you know how long that is? From 17 to 39. This is going to be fun. Prepare yourselves. This is a picture of me at 17. That is Olin Mills at its finest. Somehow they airbrushed all my acne away, and that is my hair. For contrast, this is me at 39. That's my lovely wife, Alyssa. I can see how they could get that, from that amount of time, people can change. If you put my picture up there now, you might not be able to tell me at any increment in my life who I was. if you're older than 22 in the room, I want you to think back to what we were doing 22 years ago. Just take a second. I'm 48 now. 22 years ago was a lifetime ago for me. I can't even wrap my mind around what I was like at 26. I was newly married with no kids, pastoring a church at my dad's church in Riverside, California, with Carrie Casada, who was up here earlier, and she was 20. It was a long time ago. Today, I have a 21, 17, and 16-year-old. I've lived in 8 different homes since that time. Since that time, I moved from Riverside to Redding, California, and finally I moved to Colorado. I've started 2 restaurants, helped build this building, and have pastored on staff here for almost 7 years. It's been a long time. Sometimes we just read the Bible, and I don't know what we think, but in our minds we're like, oh yeah, so he got thrown in the cistern, and then he's like, the next week he's the prime minister of Egypt. That is not how it worked. This is like a lifetime of hurt and betrayal. This is a long process. It was a journey. How long was this dream festering in his brain? How many times did he fantasize about seeing his brothers and what he might do to them if he got his hands on them? And here's where the plot thickens even further, because Joseph was 56 years old when his father Jacob finally died. That means that he was interacting with his family after he reconciled with his brothers for 17 years while they were living in Goshen. He was in Egypt. And his brothers, when their father died, the brothers are convinced that Joseph at this point is going to get back at him. They had in their mind that it was like, he's just being nice to appease dad. But as soon as dad's gone, we're in trouble. So they come up to him and they lie to him, and they're like, right after the funeral, they're like, hey, I just want to let you know, dad said right before he died, no matter what, don't do anything to your brothers. They're fine. And so it's at this point, 39 years later, Joseph is 56. He had to remind his brothers and say this: you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph's entire adult life was marked by betrayal and the fight to find forgiveness for his brothers. This is something that just came to me this week, but I was just like, have you ever thought what would have happened if Joseph didn't forgive his brothers? This is a crazy thread to take down the road. There would have been no reconciliation. So his brothers would have died off in Canaan because Joseph would have punished them and sent them back with no food. That means the brothers never moved to Goshen. That means the Israelites don't thrive and multiply in Egypt. That means the book of Exodus doesn't really even exist. There's no Israelites for the Egyptians to exploit. Moses doesn't need to enter the story to save his people. There's no Joshua, and the promised land never happens. Take the story as far as you want. We know that Jesus came from the line of Judah, who was one of Joseph's brothers that would not have been alive if he would have sent them back. This one act of forgiveness changes the course of history. It's powerful. And I know that God would have used another story to make it come together, but it's amazing to think about the ripple effects of Joseph's act of forgiveness. See, the journey starts with perspective. There are 2 consistent things that we hear about Joseph throughout his life. And the first is that the Lord was with him in everything that he did. It starts in Potiphar's house, when he's in prison, and later when he tells Pharaoh about what his dreams mean. The second thing that we know about Joseph's life is that it was a mess. And it was full of hardships. He had every right to be a disaster and to be that guy in the movie that just avenges all the wrongs. He had all the power and his brothers had absolutely nothing. But the Lord being with Joseph changed him. It let him see from God's perspective what he was doing in the larger story being written. And if you don't have perspective that God is with you and that you still have something to live for, the weight of suffering can crush you. Now, for most of us, myself included, we cannot move straight to forgiveness. It starts with perspective. We have to start by realizing that suffering is not optional. It's coming for all of us. When we are hurt by others, we have to remind ourselves of this. We are not alone. This is not unique. I can find purpose in this suffering, or I can let it crush me. It's like a well of perspective that we can draw from when it seems like there is no answers. We remember God's faithfulness to us and how he's worked things out in the past. See, Joseph could look back on the stories of Abraham, his great-grandpa, and Isaac, and his father Jacob. He vividly remembers the encounter with his uncle Esau and his father Jacob when he was 6. He has seen God's faithfulness, and he has heard these stories of faithfulness for his entire life leading up to his enslavement. See, I feel the same way. If someone would have shown me God's plan for my life to get me to where I am right now, today, step by step, I would have never agreed to it, ever. Dan, here's your life, laid out. You're going to be hurt over and over again throughout your life. As a pastor's kid, you're going to get a great foundation from the church, and your parents are going to be amazing in leading the church. But it will hurt you over and over again. It's going to make you question everything. Pastors will let you down, and you will see the inner workings of the church that can turn your stomach on the worst of days. You're going to start your own church eventually, but then you're going to have to shut that down for circumstances that are completely out of your hands. Then you're going to go help another friend start another church. And that friend is going to betray you, and you are going to be fired. And out of nowhere, you're going to have to move to Colorado and have no idea what to do with your life. In your marriage, you're going to get really angry with God because you're going to struggle with infertility and miscarriage for 7 years. In your business life, you're going to be extremely successful, but it's going to change in one day. It's all going to be taken away from you, and you're going to have to walk away from a best friend over it. And then, one day, you're going to have to struggle. You're going to have this struggle in your family that leads up to this present moment when you're asked to share about forgiveness in a message at Cornerstone. It's completely out of your hands. It's devastating, and you can't possibly see a way that it is going to be resolved. You're going to have to absorb that wrong that was done to you and your wife and forgive that person. No thanks. If someone were to lay that out for me ahead of time, I'd say, let's hear how someone else's story plays out. I think I'll take a different story. But here's what I couldn't have known that God was shaping in my life when I was going through those hard seasons. It's the gift of perspective and time. The experiences I had growing up in church had a purpose. Later in my ministry, it helped me connect with people that have been hurt by the church and feel like they are the only ones that experience doubts. I am with you. Our struggles with infertility and miscarriage helped us have a heart for the fatherless and give us empathy for people that were going through the same thing. It led us to adopt 2 amazing kids. It led us to start a nonprofit that raises tons of money to help people struggling with finances to finish their adoptions like we had. Getting fired from a church sucks. But it's going to help you know that your identity is not found in the word pastor. That was a tough lesson for me to learn, but I needed to learn that. Your restaurant experience will teach you so much about being a pastor to people outside of the church. It will also teach you how to manage budgets, oversee the craziness of a building that's always breaking down, and how to run a staff. And this is weird, but you're going to need those skills later. And I'm using them now. And I have no idea what God is teaching me in this situation I am dealing with currently. But at this point, I am no dummy. I know for certain that God uses hard things in my life to shape who I become. And from experience, letting bitterness camp out in your brain leaves room for narratives to just run wild. Am I the only one? Okay, good. I'll tell you this firsthand. I've had these rage fantasies of like, if I ever were to meet these people in the real world again, like what this would look like for them and for me. Anyone else have any of these? You don't have to raise your hand. It's okay. About 12 years ago, right before I moved here, Aaron Wardle and Josh Casada and I, we were touring in St. Louis. And we were at this huge convention. And the keynote speaker for this convention to thousands of kids was my friend that had fired me from Reading. And Josh, Aaron, and I were in this like side room where after these like massive things would happen, there'd be a spill out and there'd be a few people that would come see us and we'd lead worship and we'd through some shows. And it just so happened out of these thousands of people, we're in St. Louis, so far away from Reading. We get out of this session, I get into a hallway and I see him. And there is murder on my mind. And I am looking at him and it is so fresh. I have nowhere to go. I don't know like what is happening with my family, and I am filled with rage. And this friend of mine who was awesome, who also worked with me and was a pastor, was with this guy. And he looked at me and he saw my eyes, and he ran up to me and he took me around the corner. I think he saved his life. That is what happens. We carry this around in our bodies. And it's crazy. When it's put in front of us, it can get really messy. I can tell you that getting over that betrayal took me years. I was not in a good place when I moved to Colorado at all. Ask people that knew me. I was filled with anger and resentment. I had planned to retire in Reading. I had set up my entire life there. It was a long journey, but I can truly say today that I am free. I've processed the hurt. I've forgiven him, and I hope the best for him and his family and the church that I left. I rarely think about the situation anymore, and that's how I know that I'm free. I can't imagine what my life would look like if I was still living in the place I was living in 11 years ago when I moved here. It would be bad. To be clear, we are not best friends now. Our families are never vacationing together. And given the right setting, I can still get pretty fired up about the situation. But he does not hold me anymore. I am free. And that feels good. I'm 11 years into a journey, and I can see what God was doing. I love Colorado. I love Cornerstone. I've met some of my best friends in this state. My kids grew up here, and they love it. I started 2 restaurants here. That's cool. I did not see that in the cards. The Lord restarted my life when I was 37, and I am so grateful that he did. I didn't feel that way then, but I do now. This is an amazing quote by Tim Keller. He says that forgiveness is granted before it's felt. It's a promise before God not to take advantage of a wrongdoer for his or her sin against you. Making that promise entails 3 practical commitments. 1, you promise not to constantly bring the sin up to the wrongdoer in order to browbeat and punish them. 2, not to consistently bring the sin up to other people in order to hurt the wrongdoer's reputation and relationship with others. And 3, not to constantly bring the sin up to yourself, not to keep the anger hot, not to replay the video of it in order to cherish the feeling of nobility and virtue that comes from having been treated unjustly. That is good. You know it's good when it stings, and that one stings. All 3 of those points are great steps to know that you're actually moving through the process of forgiveness. Hard things, humiliations, disappointments, betrayal, all of those things are the training wheels for maturity. Maturity is not fun. And here's a guaranteed recipe for a horrible life, just in case anyone wants to live one of those. Stay angry, stay bitter, play the victim, stay closed off, don't be vulnerable again, hold your grudges, fuel your hatred with narratives that confirm your bias. Cancel your friends that disagree with you, walk away from relationships that are uncomfortable, and don't try to learn anything from your mistakes. Let me know how that goes. I think this is a recipe for a life worth living that looks like the life of Jesus and the life of Joseph. You forgive. You love your enemies. You turn the other cheek. You re-engage with people who have hurt you. You stay open and vulnerable. You be the first to say that you're sorry. You carry other people's burdens. You give second and third and 20th chances. You listen to both sides of an argument with nuance. You don't live in tribal circles of thinking. You learn from your mistakes and you ask for forgiveness when you're wrong. It's not easy, but that is a life worth living. And people ask, so what helps in our journey towards forgiveness? Well, they say that time heals all wounds, and that's kind of true. Time does help. It takes time to get over betrayal. And forgiveness may never happen face to face, and that is okay. Sometimes the work is sitting with it long enough to start to work through the feelings and the hurt and the betrayal and the disappointment. People outside of the situation can help. Your friends can help. Sometimes you need someone to just come along and say, hey, I think it's time. I think it's time to move on. I think it's time to let go. And finally, you have to realize that God is in control of your life. You have to trust that he is doing something in the midst of your pain. Being angry or devastated does not change the fact that the work has to be done. You cannot stay stuck forever. I have felt that way in the past. But here's the good news. The journey ends in freedom. And if we refuse to forgive a person that has wronged us, it's you that stays in bondage. When you can finally come to a place where you can release your anger and bitterness, it's only then that you can finally experience freedom. You control you. You cannot control the person that hurts you, but you can free yourself from anger, remorse, and revenge. Here's another Tim Keller one. He crushed it on this subject. He says, if a cartoonist wants to make someone look ludicrous, they can create a caricature. They can take something about a person's face that's unusual or a bit unattractive and exaggerate it, making it prominent so the person looks foolish. That's exactly what your heart does when someone wrongs you. You think of them one-dimensionally, in terms of the one thing they've done to you. If somebody has lied to you, you tell yourself, she lied because she is just a liar. But if you are ever caught in a lie and someone asks why you lied, you say, well, yes, but it's complicated. If you want to be free, you have to realize that if your sins were stacked up against you, and by the way, they were, you would never be allowed to live. And if we stack up every person's worst moment against them and believe in our hearts that they are the sum total of that one mistake, then we forfeit all the work the Lord could be doing in shaping them through this mistake. We have to leave room for God to make things right. We might never see in our lifetime, but that doesn't change we might never see like this forgiveness happen in our lifetime, but it doesn't change the fact that one day all things will be made right. Every injustice, every wound, every abuse. And when we step into the role to take justice into our own hands, we short circuit the process that the Lord could be working on to shape you and the person that made the mistake. Even if we live a lifetime of hurt and betrayal, prison and injustice, one day it will be made right. The opportunity we have in our lifetime is to live more and more like Jesus, to forgive those who have wronged us the most. And when we fully step into freedom, to forgiveness, we can finally be free. When we finally step into forgiveness, we can be free. Can you just imagine all the thoughts that were going through Joseph's mind when he sees his brothers bowing down to him, like the dream said they would, groveling on the ground and begging for grain? That was the moment. It's vengeance or it's freedom. In the story of the prodigal son, you have a father that is completely betrayed by a youngest son. The son basically tells him that he wishes he was dead. And then he runs off and squanders his life on wild living. Then he comes to his senses and he heads home. And when the son came home to the town, the town saw the father running towards the son. And they didn't think that a party was about to break out. They thought the son was about to go to the hospital. But this is a good father that was free. He had done the work. The son he had lost was back. The only thing on his mind was forgiveness. What an incredible story. You've got a father that is free of bitterness and angry, and he's ready to throw a party. That is the kind of person that I want to be. Then you have this older son who is holding on to the hurt, and you can see and you can tell that he is still in prison. Even though the truth is that everything the father has is his and it's at his fingertips. So let's do the hard work and free ourselves from the bitterness. When I have brothers show up out of nowhere and beg for forgiveness, I want to bring them close and I want to restore them. When I have a son come home that's been lost and out of his mind, I want to throw my arms around him and throw a party. These are the stories the world needs to hear. Your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, they're all watching your life. They know that you're a follower of Jesus and they want to see what makes you different. Forgiveness is that thing that makes you different. It's one of the most defining principles of followers of Jesus. See, because the world is eye for an eye. And they will cancel out of comfort. If you hurt my feelings, I'll just unfollow you. If I don't like what you have to say, if it offends me, I'm done with you. And playing the victim gets me more attention anyways. We cannot follow that playbook. The world will never change without forgiveness. The band can head on up as we close here. The question I have as we close is just this. It's very simple. Do you want to be free today? Your maturity will never happen if you don't start the journey towards forgiveness. You'll stay stuck and you'll stay angry. But maturity leads to a place of freedom where you can forgive and move on in your life. So I just have a couple questions as I end. These are things that I ask myself all the time. First one is this. Are there things that I haven't dealt with that are going to lead to regret at the end of my life? That is a great question to ask. Just ask the Lord, is there something that I haven't dealt with yet that's going to lead to regret at the end of my life? That if I were to just take a hold of this, things could change. And the second question is this. I ask myself this all the time. What is the alternative? If I do not forgive this person, what will be the result? I will tell you, that person will live rent-free right here forever. I can tell you from experience. They'll set up shop, like cozy up in the living room and just never leave you alone. So we end just by asking this: where are you today? Have you hurt somebody? Has somebody hurt you? Is there somebody that's living rent-free in your head? I am convinced that is the easiest way to know that you still have work to do. Even as I said it, you think of someone right away. There's still work to be done. What I'd like you to do, as the band just kind of plays quietly behind us, is take out your phone or a piece of paper, and if there's a name or a situation or something that comes to your mind, I want you to write it down. Sometimes it helps just to make it real and write it out. Maybe you need to text someone. Maybe you need to walk out of the room right now and make a phone call. Maybe you need to find somebody in the room that doesn't sit next to you anymore because of a certain situation that happened. And start the process of making things right. Our prayer team asked if they could come to the front. Maybe you just need to come forward and have prayer, get the journey started today. Have someone stand with you and say, you're not alone. Remind you of the truth. I felt like the Lord was saying this to me this morning as I was driving here, that there might be somebody that's sitting right next to you. And there's something that needs to get fixed in that relationship. And those are the most difficult. But what is the alternative? Let's close in prayer. Jesus, this is the heart of the gospel, that you forgave the unforgivable in us, that all of our sins were stacked upon each other and you did what only you could do. God, you've seen the worst in us. The very last breath that you took, you mustered up the strength to have forgiveness be the last words on your mouth. God, I know this is hard work. I know that this is a journey. I know that it takes time. And I just pray that today you would unlock something in people. People that are stuck, people that are in it. I'm including myself. God, would you unlock something in me that helps me move to a place where I can be free one day? I pray you break down the prisons that people are living in, and that they could start to walk in freedom today. Would you be with us in that process? I thank you that you never leave us. Amen.
Just gonna sing this simple chorus over you as you continue to reflect. Your ways are higher than my ways. Your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. Your word is perfect for today. Your timing is never late. Your ways are higher than my ways. Your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. Your word is perfect for today, and your timing is never ever late. So I surrender, and I say yes, Lord, to your will and to your ways. Let your kingdom come down, will be done now. Through your Spirit and your word. The way we want to end today, so I'm going to pray a blessing over you. But if you want to stay and reflect more, you want to stay and get some prayer or worship, we invite you to just stay here and linger. If you've got to go, I just pray this blessing that just the spirit of forgiveness begin to well up in us as we see the forgiveness the Lord gives to us, and we begin to extend that to others, to the glory of God for our own good and for their good. And so I bless you in the name of Jesus. May you begin to embrace the process of forgiveness. Like I said, if you want to stay, please do. If you've got to go, blessings on you. Have a wonderful day. Our prayer team's up here.